Good morning, everyone. Glad to see everyone coming out for our Bible study hour. We will hold all of our announcements and prayer requests until our worship hour at 10:30. So as we get ready to go to class this morning, let's go to God in prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this wonderful day that you've given us, for this opportunity to come here this morning and gather together and study your word, Lord. Lord, we are so blessed to have such wonderful teachers that work so hard to prepare their lesson. And Lord, we pray we do all things that are pleasing to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Go to class.
Morning, everyone. If you'd like to be turning to the book of Deuteronomy, we will be in chapter 19. Deuteronomy chapter 19. Before we start in our study, just wanted to mention one thing. A few weeks ago, I opened one of our classes saying that we had lost one of the giants in the brotherhood. That was with the death of Brother Alan Hires, who was quite well known, associated with the Freed Hardeman lectureships, the Polishing the Pulpit, edited the Spiritual Sword quarterly magazine for many, many years. And in the last few days, we've also lost another one. That was a great warrior for Christ within the Brotherhood, and that was Brother Earl Edwards. Brother Earl Edwards taught for many years at Freed Hardeman College and University, and was a published author, quite a defender of the faith, missionary. At one time, he was 92 years old, and he passed away a week ago Saturday. He had spent that morning at age 92 out knocking doors to invite people to church, and then he went home, and sometime later in the day, he passed away. So we're losing some of the great men of the past, and hopefully we're getting ones that are coming along that one day, when they're of that age, both these men were in their 90s, when they're of that age, that they will be numbered among that group. Okay, not Proverbs, Deuteronomy chapter 19, and we're about to start with verse 15 of Deuteronomy 19. Now, the first part of this chapter, matter of fact, the whole chapter basically has been concerned with the idea of legal matters in Israel. Once the Israelites have conquered Canaan and settled there, they're going to be faced with certain legal needs. And so Moses was there telling them what they needed to do, what procedures they needed to follow in order to meet the legal needs that would arise. We talked about, in the first paragraph of this chapter, about the cities of refuge, actually in the first and second paragraphs. Those cities of refuge were places where someone who had killed another, either accidentally or in self-defense, could flee to the city of refuge and there be protected from retaliation by the dead person's family. And we talked about all of the things that were involved in that. We ended class last week talking about the one verse paragraph on verse 14 that had to do with theft of real estate. And that was done in the ancient world, of course, by moving the boundary markers that were set up, usually stones or posts that were put in. And if you move those boundary markers between you and your neighbor, and you could do it, you could increase what property was yours and decrease what property was your neighbor's. But that was still stealing. And so it was to be forbidden by the Israelites. Now we're getting down to the paragraph that begins at verse 15. It's still in the overall concept of legal directions. This has to do with witnesses in legal proceedings. And if someone could read chapter 19, verses 15 through 21 for us, please.
One witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses the matter shall be established. If a false witness arises against any man to testify against him of wrongdoing, then both men and their controversy shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who serve in these days, those days. And the judges shall make careful inquiry, and indeed, if the witness is a false witness, who has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother, so that you shall put away the evil from among you. And those who remain shall hear and fear, and hereafter they shall not commit such evil among you. Your eye shall not pity. Life shall be for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot.
Okay, thanks, Larry. Welcome back. I'm used to hearing you read from the ESV, but that wasn't the ESV. Oh, okay. Just threw me off there. And that's no problem. It's a fine thing. So anyway, you see this paragraph has to do with witnesses and what the rules are concerning the conduct of witnesses. Now, in the ancient legal system, there was no DNA evidence when a crime had been committed. There were no forensic teams, CSIs, that descended upon any particular crime scene to help establish it. The number one source of information about what had actually happened when a crime had been committed were witnesses, eyewitnesses. A little bit later on, we may or may not get to it today, there's a procedure of what do you do when you find somebody murdered and nobody saw it. That's also included in the instruction that Moses is given. But here, he's specifically talking about witnesses. Now, we all know eyewitness testimony can be good or it can be not so good. We all know that eyewitnesses don't always see what they think they saw. We also know that people can have strong feelings against another person. Has anybody ever been known to make up charges against somebody that were untrue? Happens all the time, apparently. And so that was a problem. God knew that was a problem. So the rule here was basically that because of individual grudges, because of eyewitness mistakes that could be made, the law of Moses did not allow for any judgment against a person to be based upon the testimony of one witness alone. Now, that witness may be telling the truth. That witness may not have a grudge against the person. That witness may remember exactly what happened. But the danger was so great of abuse that one witness alone was just not a reliable way to try to establish the truth of what had happened. So the standard in the law of Moses was that there had to be two, preferably three, witnesses before, and they had to agree on what they said, before it could be considered as reliable testimony, as reliable evidence. Now, God realized that there would be certain ones who, as the ESV says, are called malicious witnesses. They would certainly be false witnesses as well. These were people who were providing false testimony, and they would be violating one of the 10 Commandments. Anybody remember offhand which one? It's the same as a love potion in the song. Number 9. Yeah, commandment number 9 was the one that said, "Thou shalt not bear false witness." A lot of times that gets applied to lying. It didn't mean that. When the 10 Commandments were done, it had to be this legal situation. The idea of false witness was being a malicious witness, being a lying witness, witnessing to something that was not true. So Moses saying, if you find out, the leaders, the judicial leaders in Israel, find out that a person has given false witness, they have become a malicious witness. And by malicious, it means somebody could give false witness, but they may not intend to. They just may be mistaken about what they saw, what they remember. Malicious, I think, gets to the very heart of it, the fact that they're doing it with the intent to harm another person. And so when that happens, Moses is saying, here's the way you have to judge things when you get there. All judgments have to follow the same procedures. In other words, both the accuser and the accused get to present their side of the story. Notice this is somewhat similar to our own legal system, and that's because it's a pretty good way to do it when you're trying to determine the truth. Both the accuser and the accused go before the priests, and the religious leaders were very much involved, as we've seen in the legal system in Israel. They go before the priests and the judges, and the judges, again, are always required to do a diligent inquiry into the case. They just don't take their responsibilities lightly. They're to really dig and try to get to the bottom of the particular situation. And their main thing is to try to determine, this charge has been made against someone by this witness. Is the charge true, or is the charge not true? Now, after all of their investigation, if they find that the charge is true and they determine that the weight of the evidence that they have examined and the testimony that they have heard leads them, the legal leaders, to believe that the charge is true, then the person who's been accused is in effect found guilty and would be subject to the punishment that's mandated in the law for that particular crime of which he's been accused. In some cases, that punishment would be the death penalty. In other cases, it would be other things, the repayment of monies. There are many different remedies that are contained within the law of Moses. But basically, people weren't just found innocent or guilty, or not supposed to be anyway, willy-nilly. There was a process. There was a legal system in ancient Israel that God set up, that Moses told them about, just like we have a legal system today. But if those legal leaders, judicial leaders, found that the charges that had been made against a person were not true, and the judges determined that the accuser was a malicious witness. That is, a false witness who was seeking to do harm to his brother. Then the situation was the accuser would receive the same punishment that he sought to inflict on the one that he was accusing. So if the punishment was the death sentence, if the person had been found guilty, if he were not, then the malicious witness would receive what? The death penalty. He would get the same that he was going. If it had to be paying a fine, let's say, that was the punishment for what he was accusing the other person of, then he would have to pay the same amount in the fine. So that was the system that was set up for ancient Israel. Moses also says here that the just execution of the law, getting it right, making the system work, were they going to be perfect in administering this system? No, they weren't. But it had to be fair and within the rules for people to have faith in it, for people not to be, cause it to be a bone of contention and disunion within the land. There was to be, the goal was the just execution of the law that would result in punishing those who were found guilty and actually had done what they were accused of doing, punishing those who would bear false witness. And either way, these actions would be a deterrent. Those who were found guilty and punished, that would be a deterrent to other people doing the same thing. One who was a malicious witness and found guilty and punished, that would also keep others from becoming false witnesses, malicious witnesses, and well. And then we get to that last verse, which is pretty much in everybody's idea. It shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Now, the meaning of this last verse in the paragraph is to ensure that the law was applied in a fair manner, without any partiality or variation from what the law required. Have you ever seen in our legal system where in different jurisdictions, two people could be found guilty of committing the same crime? One could go to jail for 10 years, the other one could get 2 years probation. That happens. They did not want that to happen in ancient Israel. And so that's what this last verse is talking about, the fair administration across the board of justice. In other words, justice demanded that the guilty person suffer the exact same thing that they had inflicted upon the other person. If I stole money from you, then what should I have to do? Pay back the money, maybe pay even more with a penalty on it, but that's the idea. Whatever I've done, that's what's done to me in punishment. No more, but also no less. It was to be a pretty even thing. And that's something that hasn't always happened in society. I was reading not too long ago about an incident that happened in the state of Texas. The year was 1893. A local man who was there, he was known to have a diminished mental capacity. The writer of the book from that particular time period basically said he was an imbecile. That was the word we don't use that anymore, but he had a defective mental capacity. diminished, that man got drunk. And while he was drunk, he took and killed the young daughter of a man that he had been in conflict with. Did he commit a crime? Yes. Did he commit the crime of murder? Yes. And under the laws of the state of Texas that time, what was the punishment for committing murder of this type? The death penalty. Yes, that's true. However, when the man was caught, he was not processed through the legal system. Instead of him facing trial, the local authorities turned him over to a frenzied mob. And what that mob did was, first of all, to strip him of his clothing. They tied him to a wooden platform. Then for hours, they heated hot pokers in the fire. And they burned his skin from head to toe, including the eyes, by thrusting these hot pokers against him. Only after hours of this torture was the platform finally ignited and he was allowed to burn to death. Now, that is not what God meant, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, because this punishment was well in excess of just the simple death of the person. This idea of eye for eye, tooth for tooth was to prevent that type of thing from happening in ancient Israel. This concept was to ensure that the punishment fit the crime, yes, but it was also to ensure that the punishment did not exceed the crime. We usually think when somebody talks about eye for eye, tooth to tooth, that that was a bad thing in the ancient Israelite legal system. It was not. It was a fair thing. It was a protective thing. It protected people from excessive punishment for anything that they had done. God gave this idea of eye for eye and tooth for tooth. This concept was a judicial principle. It was to be used by the legal system in ancient Israel. It was never intended to be applied by individuals in a personal matter that would involve retaliation against another person. So as individuals, even in ancient Israel, they were not to be able to say, I'm going out and I'm going to damage this person who has damaged me under the eye for eye, tooth for tooth principle. Didn't apply to that situation. It was a legal concept and a legal principle, not individual. Christ so taught that in Matthew chapter 5. And there, he, verses 38 through 42, he showed that no, the Christian response, as indeed would have been the response if they accurately followed the law of Moses, was no individual retaliation against someone who had wronged you. And that's why we have Jesus' teaching. It was in conflict with what the law of Moses said. When he said, you've heard it said eye for an eye and tooth for tooth, he's saying don't resist. He's talking about people who had used that excuse for individual actions, not for the legal system. Questions or comments? Okay, let's move on then to the next paragraph. Actually, we're getting to go into a new chapter. We're headed to chapter 20. So moving right along in this study. Chapter 20, and we're going to make a little bit of change. He's still talking about, as he always is, about what the Israelites need to know once they get into Canaan, once they settle there, how to live successfully, how to live in accordance with God's instructions when they're in Canaan. But this particular paragraph has to do with some rules for warfare as they are going into Canaan and even after they have settled there. Verses 1 through 9, if we could get someone to read those for us, please.
When you go into battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them. For the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. So shall it be when you are on the verge of battle, the priests shall approach and speak to the people. And he shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are on the verge of battle with your enemies. Do not let your heart faint. Do not be afraid. Do not tremble or be terrified because of them. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. Then the officers shall speak to the people, saying, What man is there who has built a new house and is not dedicated? Let him go and return to the house, lest he die in the battle, and none man dedicate it. And what man is there among you that has planted a vineyard that is not yet eaten from it? Let him also go and return to his house, lest he die in the battle, and none man eat of it. And what man is there who is betrothed to a woman and has not yet married her? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in battle, and another man marry her. Then the officer shall speak further and say, What man is there who is fearful and faint of heart? Let him go and return to his house, lest the heart of his brethren faint like his heart. So shall it be with the officers who finish speaking to the people. They shall make captains of the armies to lead the people.
Okay, like I say, this chapter, Moses is turning to a subject of military and how the military should act once the Israelites have invaded Canaan, even after they've settled it, because some of the things here have to do with the type of warfare that would be beyond just the invasion of the land. And the very first and foremost concept that he wants to get across is that the fighting men must accept something as a fact. And that something is that God will win the battle for them. If God's going to win the battle for the army of Israel, then does the army of Israel think that it all depends upon them? No. They need to acknowledge they're not the ones that are actually going to win these battles. God is going to win it for them. Therefore, Moses goes on to say, it should not matter to the army of Israel if they look out and they see an army that's much larger than their own. Normally, if you're in an army going up against a larger army, is that a cause for some concern? Absolutely. What Moses is saying here is don't bat an eye at it because it's not a problem for God. You needn't be worried if you look out and you see that there's a larger army. Or if you look out and you see that the army you're going up against has military equipment that's superior to yours, you needn't worry about that either. If they have horses and chariots and you don't, then that's not a problem. Incidentally, horses and chariots were a great advance in military at the time of the Old Testament. They were the equivalent of tanks in, let's say, the World War I, World War II particular era. And the Israelites did not have much at this time in the way of horses and chariots at all. So when they looked out and they saw the enemy army and they saw all these horses and chariots, the natural reaction is one of, I'm afraid we might lose. But that's not the idea that they should have. They should trust in God regardless of the fact that they were outnumbered. They should trust in God regardless of if the enemy had superior military equipment because of a reason. And that reason was not just something warm and fuzzy. That reason was based upon evidence. They had evidence that God could cause them to overcome stronger military opponents. And Moses is talking about the victory that God had given by his actions as they were coming out of Egypt. The great army of Pharaoh with lots of horses and chariots. Where is that army when Moses is speaking? The bottom of the Red Sea. That's the evidence. God's not asking them to believe just because he says it. He's given them evidence that they can look back. It actually happened, that God delivered these people from what was perhaps the mightiest army on the face of the earth at that time. And so that's why they should believe. And just depart a little bit here from the context, let me say, this is always the way that God has acted. He does not ask us to believe anything unless there is evidence. And he's provided example evidence for everything that we believe. There's evidence of creation. There's all sorts of evidence for what God has done. And those who say, oh, Christians just have a blind faith. There may be some who think they do, but that's not true. The Christian faith is and always has been based upon evidence that God has provided. Now Moses goes on here, once he's gotten through talking about don't be afraid because God's going to give you the victory. He moves on to a little bit different aspect of it. You know, we're now in football season. Every Saturday and Sunday, there's a lot of football on TV. And we know that before each game, the coaches bring the team together and they give them a pep talk. Jeff and I hope the coaches of the Cleveland Browns will do better in their pep talks in coming weeks than they have done so far, but all the team's coaches give them pep talks. And that pep talk is designed to do certain things. It's designed to remind the team of what's important. It's designed to encourage them to give their best. It's designed to unify the team by pointing to and having them focus upon a common goal, which is victory upon the football field. Like I say, some coaches are better than others at this, but they all do it. And Moses here is saying basically he wants the same thing to happen in Israel with the army before they go to battle. He wants them to get a pep talk. And he says shortly before the battle, a priest should come and talk to the army. And he should do those things that a football coach is trying to remind his team of. Reminding them not to be afraid, reminding them that God will give them the victory. So that's the procedure. They were to have a priest come and talk to the army before they went into battle. Now we have to say that in ancient Israel, the priests and the Levites were exempted from military service. And we reread about the numbering of Israel. That's the numbering of fighting men. It did not include any of the priests or the Levites in that number. So, because they were not fighting men. They had a different role in God's kingdom other than fighting. But they still had an important role in the military operations. And here we see what part of that role was. It was to help to prepare the army for the battle. So the priests and the Levites, although they were exempt from being fighting men, they still were providing a supporting role for the military objective that the army was seeking. And then Moses goes on here, incidentally, to say, it's not just the priests and the Levites who are exempt from military service. And Moses briefly mentioned some other exemptions that were also available to them. And the first three exemptions that he mentioned would all fall in the general category of not interrupting important events in a man's life by having him be in military service, because these important events were vital in contributing to successful living in Canaan. And after all, what was Moses and God's intent for the book of Deuteronomy? How to live successful lives in Canaan once you're there. And so he mentions three military exemptions right here. One is somebody who is building a new house, and they are exempt from military service until basically they actually move in to that house, all the while it's being built. Now, I don't know how long you can stretch out building a house, but I'm sure that might have occurred to some folks then, but that was, of course, not the intent of it. The idea is it's important for houses to be built and occupied in Canaan, for the Israelites to live successfully there. So you're building a house, you're exempt until you've actually moved in and occupied that house. The second one had to do, again, with getting settled and prospering and living successful in Canaan. It had to do with planting a vineyard. And a man was exempt while he had planted the vineyard until he actually harvested from the new vineyard and was able to actually enjoy some of the fruit. So here again, I didn't look up for how long from planting to being able to harvest from a vineyard is. I just honestly don't know, but he was exempt from military service during that time. And the third exemption was marrying a wife. Someone who was betrothed, engaged, let's say, would not be required to go for military service. Wonder how many people got engaged real quickly when a war was on the horizon. But they were not required to go to military service until after they had married and the family had then been established. All three of these exemptions are not just good things, they're towards the goal of helping the Israelites live successful lives. Another exemption, though, that Moses made was those who were afraid. Our modern armies have exemptions for people. I don't know of any army that has an exemption of, if you're afraid, you don't have to serve. I don't think many armies have that, but in ancient Israel, they did have that. Jim? Oh. Yes.
Now, would that not mean, looking at that, I mean, of course, I'm not a scholar, but, looking at that, it looks like, he started to build his house before the battle, and he died in the battle, somebody else was
Yeah.
ready to build his house.
Right. Yeah, that's the whole idea for the exemption, so that he would be able to complete this important life event of building and occupying a house, planting and harvesting a vineyard, and marrying a wife. Because if someone is in the military, is there a chance they may die in battle? Absolutely. And so that's the reason for the exemptions. They wanted these men who were in the midst of these important life events to be able to complete them. And then at the completion, then they would become eligible for military service. So that the fact of them dying in battle, if there was no chance of them dying, it wouldn't make any difference. But because there was a chance of dying, that's why they were exempt. The next exemption has to do with those who were afraid. And Moses is very clear on the purpose of this exemption. It was to keep the fearful from contaminating the other men with their fear. God didn't want those who were afraid to talk about it and get the other people who were there, the other men there, afraid. Now, a perfect example of what God is talking about here in actually what Moses is mentioning in this whole paragraph, when we see it in practice, occurred during the life of Gideon. And we all remember the story, I'm sure. Gideon was facing, as the military leader of Israel in the book of Judges, he was facing an army of 135,000 soldiers. Gideon's forces numbered only 32,000. Gideon had a 4-to-1 disadvantage in numbers. Is that pretty overwhelming? In military terms, yes, it is. And yet, God said, Gideon, you've got too many soldiers. And so God reduced Gideon's army even further. First of all, he said, anybody that is afraid can go home. That's basically implementing what Moses had said here. Then, even though not enough left for that, then there was that drinking water test. You know, how did they drink water down at the stream? And after that test, Gideon was left with an army of 300 men to go up against 135,000. That is a 450-to-1 disadvantage. Can anybody win a battle when they're at a 450-to-1 disadvantage in normal circumstances? No. And yet, we know that God used those 300 men of Gideon. They won the battle. They won it decisively over the much larger foe. So that's an example exactly of what God's talking about here through Moses in this paragraph. The final instruction has to do with leadership. There needs to be army leadership so that all would know who to follow and who had been appointed as leaders. Now, some might say, well, isn't God going to do the fighting? Well, yes, God is, but he's going to do the fighting using the people who are part of Israel's army. And so the leaders were needed. And leaders were needed in order to recognize when God was giving them an opportunity for victory. They were needed to take advantage of the opportunities that God was giving them and that God had created for them. So that's the importance of leadership of the army. There had to be somebody to say, okay, God's given us this, let's go get it and take through. Okay, that's our time's basically out as we conclude this paragraph. We'll pick up next time we're together with verse 10 and paragraph about some other rules of war for the Israelites that are pretty interesting. Juanita and I leave tomorrow for vacation. We're going up to North Carolina, pick up our son. He has 2 weeks of vacation coming, and then we're going to go up through the Shenandoah Valley, eventually get up into the Adirondacks. The Sunday we're up there, we hope to be over at the Plattsburgh, New York church and maybe look across and see Vermont while we're there. But we will be gone for the next 3 Sunday mornings. I think, I'm pretty sure Rusty is on board to be teaching the class here in my absence. So that will be, my absence will be well filled for that. Thank you all very much, and Lord willing, we'll see you all again after the vacation.